Merci, Monsieur le Président. Excellence, distinguished guests, dear colleagues, and as my African friends say, all protocols duly observed. Let me preface my remarks by a word of thanks to the government and people of Morocco for the gracious hospitality that's been extended to all of us participants, especially to the High Commission for Planning, which has been responsible for this important initiative and in general and for organizing this panel in particular. On a personal note, I'm very gratified and honored to be part of this panel and delighted to join a number of old friends as well as some new ones in addressing the question of what new paradigms for regional security in a prospective approach. I congratulate the organizers of this panel for that formulation of the question, which sets before us three critical elements. First, the novelty of the historic moment in which we find ourselves. Secondly, the need for regional cooperation and indeed integration. And thirdly, the imperative of being expansive in our strategic horizons and forward-leaning in our perspective. Given the reminder, Monsieur le Président, that you gave us to limit our time, let me confine myself to simply briefly outlining a few considerations on each of these 3 points. First, the features of the new strategic environment in which we find ourselves in the wake of the transformative change that swept across North Africa and the Middle East since the beginning of 2011 are well known, as is the uncertainty which the new dynamics engender. This, in turn, will have its effect on external actors, including the European Union and the United States, both of which face new realities themselves with economic and fiscal constraints whose reckoning cannot be deferred much longer. Not everything that is new is necessarily positive. As several of my colleagues have already pointed out, the new patterns of trafficking and criminality, which now link the western shores of the Atlantic Ocean in Latin America with the ocean's eastern shore in West Africa, in all the wrong ways, via criminal networks smuggling drugs into Europe through Africa's poorly governed spaces and porous borders. West Africa is also seeing increasing incidents of maritime piracy and other maritime disorders, which take advantage not only of the lack of funding for and capacity on the part of naval and other forces in the region, but also the lack of cooperation between the nation states. Meanwhile, all this has led to a nexus between criminality and extremism in the Sahel, as my colleague mentioned just now. If the link between organized criminality and conflict is obvious in the kidnapping for ransom business, tensions related to the growing drug trade and the erosion of state institutions through their complicity with organized crime play an even more important role in the dynamics which have led to outbreaks of conflict, including in Mali this past year. While the current conflict in Mali is not exclusively or even predominantly a clash between rival criminal networks, other interests and grievances contribute to the conflict. Nevertheless, we have to be frank that the actors involved in organized crime did play some leading roles and wield decisive political and military influence, a fact that will have to be reckoned with as we search for a common solution. All this reinforces the logic behind a need for the third point, a new Atlanticism that not only builds on the traditional security framework, but also requires embracing other aspects of human security, including energy security and food security. It will call for an investment in infrastructure as a catalyst for economic and social development, as well as renewed political commitment to overcoming tensions which impede the type of regional cooperation and integration whose economic costs, especially here in the Maghreb, are so well known. While some have adopted the view that the new approach to Atlanticism should focus on the admittedly increasingly important South-South dimension, I would argue that an exclusive focus on the South-South dimension is unlikely to replace long-standing patterns of cooperation in the short or even intermediate term, and would be in any event too limiting. Let me therefore conclude by suggesting a few steps which might be undertaken concretely. First, the states of the Southern Atlantic need to internally foster the conditions for their own development, political, economic, and social. Allow me to simply point out the success of Morocco's own reform efforts and the role that has played in enhancing the kingdom's position within the Atlantic geopolitical space. Secondly, human security, the control of borders, air and maritime domain awareness should all be priorities for bilateral and multilateral cooperation. In a way, because the lesser controversies, less politically charged nature of maritime and air domain awareness, these are particularly good first steps to build confidence. Thirdly, the countries of West Africa and Latin America by themselves and with their European and North American partners need to work together to address the criminal nexus increasingly linking the regions of the Atlantic. And finally, we ought to consider a forum to bring together the various infrastructures already existing, whether those be bilateral, multinational, regional, or within the domain of a single country, but expansive in their geographic reach within the Atlantic space. There are various initiatives, as the Admiral pointed out, in the Caribbean, in the North Atlantic space, also within, internal to the United States, the various regional combatant commands for the military, as well as sub-regional and regional organizations on the African side, and the various initiatives, including the initiative in Morocco for the Rabat process for the African countries on the Atlantic Ocean. There needs to be a forum to bring together these various infrastructures so they are first even made aware of each other, and then ultimately to seek concrete steps for collaboration so that the things that fall between the seams do not cause actually further problems down the line. And with that, I think I'll conclude. Thank you.